Now, action potentials for neurons. Okay, we have 3 basic steps that go very quickly. We have depolarization, which we're kind of familiar with. We have repolarization that we're kind of familiar with. And then we have hyperpolarization. Okay, that's going to be new for us. So if you remember back to action potentials for muscle physiology, okay, what we're about to talk about is like 90-95% the exact same. Okay, there's only some slight differences, but they're kind of a big deal. Okay, this hyperpolarization being one of them. Okay, so depolarization we're familiar with. We're going to go from our resting membrane potential, which is negative, we're going to become positive. That's depolarization. Repolarization allows us to return to that negative value. So we're going to go back down towards resting membrane potential. Again, that's familiar to us. But then we have hyperpolarization. Okay. Hyperpolarization is not something that we saw in muscle physiology. So this is one of our brand new steps. Hyperpolarization involves you're kind of overdoing it a little bit. You're going beyond resting membrane potential. You've gone more negative than what you needed to. So remember, for neurons, resting membrane was -70. So maybe we went -75 or -80. Okay, before we came back to rest. Why do we have these 3 phases? It's because of how the ion channels open and close. Okay. So, first step is local potentials. Okay. We have to be able to depolarize the axon enough to where we hit a level that's called threshold. Okay. So we said local potentials or graded potentials, they can vary. Okay. We said sometimes we only change the membrane potential a little bit. Sometimes we change it a little bit more. Okay. We are looking, if we want to do an action potential, okay, if we want to do an action potential, we are looking to depolarize at least to threshold, which is -55 millivolts. Okay. If we hit -55 millivolts, then it's on, you guys. If you hit -55, you do full-on depolarization. Okay. You do full-on depolarization. You know that this involves opening voltage-gated sodium channels. Okay, sodium ions will rush into our cell. We will jump from -55 all the way up to our favorite +30 millivolts. Okay. This is actually an example of a positive feedback loop because as soon as you activate the first voltage-gated sodium channel and sodium starts to rush into the cell, the potential, the membrane potential of the neighboring section of membrane actually also becomes more and more positive, and it will eventually open more and more sodium channels down the line. Okay, so this is actually how we do propagation, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in detail, but just to kind of throw that out there, this is an example of positive feedback. Now, we just activated sodium channels. We just opened them up, those voltage-gated sodium channels. Okay, we have gone from resting membrane potential, we hit threshold, we jumped up to +30. Okay, you know at +30, it's time to start working our way back down. We have to start working towards repolarization. So the very first thing that has to happen, we need to inactivate our sodium channels. Okay, we need to get our bathtub plug involved. Okay, once we plug up our sodium channels, our voltage-gated potassium channels now activate. They open up. This allows sodium to stop moving, but it allows potassium to start moving. And if you remember, our potassium starts in the cytosol and it's going to move out into the extracellular fluid. Okay? While the potassium channels are opening, while potassium is moving, this gives sodium channels a chance to go from inactivated to resting. Okay, and repolarization is going to continue. Okay, the axolemma, okay, which again, axon, lemma, plasma membrane, so there's your fun new science word. Axolemma could hyperpolarize before the potassium ion channels completely get back to rest. So you're going to let a few extra potassium ions escape. Okay. This will cause the kind of overdoing it a little bit, right? We wanted to stop at -70. Oof, maybe we got down to like -75. Don't forget, we do have our sodium potassium pump and we have our leak channels that help us get back to -70 on the dot. All right, this is what it looks like. We've got our action potential coming in, well, excuse me, our local potential coming in from the left. We are going to change the membrane potential. We're going to hit threshold, so you'll see we've gone from -70, we're going to hit -55. Okay. Once threshold has hit, we activate our favorite voltage-gated voltage-gated sodium channels. Okay. So here we go. Open those guys up. We are letting sodium rush into the cell. This causes a huge jump in membrane potential. We're going to go up to that +30 that we are familiar with. Next, we must inactivate our sodium channels. Got our little bathtub plug. Okay. While we are plugging up our sodium channels, we are also opening up our potassium channels. We are letting potassium escape into the extracellular fluid. This helps us move from a +30. We're going to start going negative. We're going to start to do repolarization. Okay. While we still have our potassium channels open, this gives sodium channels enough time to go from inactivated back to rest. Okay. You'll notice that since we are still moving potassium ions, we are continuing to go back down towards resting membrane potential, and we overdo it just a little bit. Here's our hyperpolarization. We went just a little too far, okay? But eventually our potassium channels close as well, and our good old sodium potassium pump, which, bless it, never makes it in our pictures, okay? They help us get back to -70 on the dot, okay? This is just kind of a conceptual view. We have our dendrites that would receive incoming signals, okay? Our resting membrane potential here, again, would be -70. If we start doing graded potentials at the axon, we're hoping to hit threshold. If we do hit threshold, if we do hit -55, we can create a legitimate action potential that will be propagated down the entire axon until we hit the axon terminal. Okay. We have discussed what happens at the neuromuscular junction. Okay. We are next going to talk about what happens at the synapse of one neuron to the next neuron. Okay. That's coming up. Okay, a couple more quick notes. Local anesthetics. Okay, it is likely that you or somebody you know has perhaps had a dental procedure and needed to use lidocaine. Okay, this is a temporary numbing agent that can be used to numb very specific areas, perhaps the tooth that is about to have a procedure done on it. Here's how lidocaine works, and here's why we care, and here's how it's related. Lidocaine blocks voltage-gated sodium channels, which prohibit depolarization, okay, which inhibits action potentials. Specifically, the action potentials relaying pain information. Okay, so it's not that you're not in pain, it hurts. Okay, your brain just isn't getting those pain signals to interpret, so it's kind of like we're not in pain after all, which is kind of nice. Nobody likes to be in pain, right? Now, there's a downside. These are non-selective. So lidocaine can't tell like which sodium channels specifically are going to be associated with your pain receptors. And so lidocaine will basically just block all of them in a local area. This causes also temporary paralysis because you are also blocking the sodium channels of your skeletal muscles, which means you have a crooked smile for a while. You are probably going to drool for a while. Your best friend might make fun of you for a while, but they still love you. It's okay. But this is how lidocaine works. Okay, it is a voltage-gated sodium channel blocker. All right, refractory period. Okay, we briefly mentioned refractory periods when we talked about muscle physiology. Now we're specifically going to talk about the refractory period of a neuron. Okay, we have both an absolute and a relative refractory period for neurons. Okay, your relative and your absolute refractory periods, we are talking about periods where it is either absolutely impossible or very difficult to start a new action potential. Okay, so absolute refractory period, I don't care how hard you try, I don't care how hard you stimulate that neuron, you cannot, okay, produce another action potential. Okay, no additional stimulus is able to produce an additional action potential. Why? Because you're not even finished doing the one you're working on. Okay. This coincides with the activation and the inactivation of voltage-gated sodium channels. Okay, so I've already mentioned that you cannot go from rest to active back to rest for a sodium channel. You have got to do that third step. You have got to do inactivation. Okay, this is coinciding with our absolute refractory period. So you'll see first part is your sodium channels are activated, they're open. Okay. The second half we have inactivated our sodium channels, and we have already begun to activate our potassium channels. Okay, so this covers most of depolarization and repolarization. Okay, we have hit threshold and we have come back to threshold basically. Okay, but there is one extra little section. Okay, that's your relative refractory period. Okay, you can start a new action potential here, but your stimulus has to be stronger than the first time. Okay, because this includes your hyperpolarization phase. Okay, so if you give it the same stimulus as the first time, okay, this would be in coinciding with our first stimulus, this short little period. Okay, if you give it the same stimulus, we went from -70 to -55. That hit threshold, that was no big deal. But over here, we're below -70. Which means we wouldn't hit -55, we wouldn't hit threshold. Okay, if you want to start a new action potential here, okay, your second stimulus has to be even stronger to ensure that we hit threshold so we can start a new action potential. Okay, this also coincides with voltage-gated sodium channels going back to rest, so we would be able to activate them again. Okay. Potassium channels are still being activated, or well, they're still open, I should say. You have potassium that is still moving. We haven't quite finished closing them all yet. Okay. So again, we can trigger a new action potential here. We just have to work a little harder at it. All right, one last thing about local versus action potentials. Local potentials are reversible. When the stimulus ends, your neuron goes back to resting membrane potential. Okay. However, action potentials are irreversible. Once you hit threshold, you cannot stop an action potential from starting, and once it starts, it's going to finish. Okay, we call this the all or none principle. You either do it or you don't do it. There is no in between. Okay. Our other difference, the signal distance. So for local potentials, we say that they are decremental. It's a nice science word. Okay. This means that the strength of the signal decreases as you move down the plasma membrane. So the farther you have to go, the less strong the signal is. Action potentials, however, are non-decremental. They do not decrease in strength, even though they have to travel long distances. Okay, so local potentials, they are reversible. Okay, so you can send one and it doesn't necessarily send a whole signal. Okay, you don't necessarily start an action potential. Action potentials, however, once you start them, they continue, they are irreversible. Local potentials, again, are decremental, so they decrease in strength. Action potentials are non-decremental, so they are just as strong at the beginning as they are at the end.